Hello, I'm Mia Hunt, editor of Global Government Forum, the publishing, events and research business serving civil servants around the world. Welcome to our webinar on developing immunity, IT security in the era of remote working, covering new and emerging cybersecurity risks and ways to combat them. This webinar is run in association with global cybersecurity provider Tripwire, and you'll hear from Paul Eden, Director International Services at Tripwire in a moment. Before you do, I have a couple of housekeeping notes. Just to let you know, the webinar is being recorded in part so that we can produce an article for publication on Global Government Forum. Now, at the end, we've set aside a good chunk of time to answer your questions. So please do click on the Q&A box at the foot of the Zoom window and type any questions you have in there. I'll keep an eye on it and we'll get through as many as we can during the Q&A session after Paul's presentation. And if you have any further questions after the event, Tripwire will be happy to answer them. We'll email everyone with the contact when we send out the link to the recording and the write-up. That's all from me for now. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Maria. So first of all, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for attending. And I would like to start off by apologising. My laptop gave up the ghost just before we got into this, so Maria's kindly agreed to do my slides for me. So, quick introduction. Paul Eden, as you've been told, the Director for International Services at Tripwire. My background is over 20 years working for various military and government intelligence agencies, and the last 20 years working for commercial vendors of security products. I'd like to set the scene before we get going. So over the past 6 months, COVID-19 has moved from a concern to a threat and finally to a pandemic. The threat to life has forced governments to quarantine cities, districts, states, and through closing of borders, countries. This same threat has also forced organizations and individuals to take what some would describe as extreme steps. We've had to embrace new living and working practices, such as constantly sanitizing whilst apparently singing happy birthday, social distancing, which I see as a legal requirement to sit in a different room to my kids. But probably for most people on this call, the most impactful change has been the need for remote working. The unplanned expansion of business network boundaries has compelled organizations to quickly source additional hardware, reconfigure their access controls, and identify and implement new and sometimes very unfamiliar tools to provide users with some level of remote, and to provide users hopefully with some level of remote training. As a consequence of these changes, many organizations feel that they've left themselves less secure and with probably a raised risk profile. And to make it worse and more challenging, while organizations have been busy focusing on enabling the new remote workforce, hackers and cyber criminals have been quick to capitalize on the crisis and the lack of organizational focus in areas such as cybersecurity. Can we go to the first slide, please? So here's the agenda, but just again, as a bit of background, between the 14th and the 21st of April this year, Tripwire conducted a survey on COVID-19's impact on cybersecurity. We received a response from over 340 security professionals employed within small, medium and large enterprise across both North America and EMEA. Now, I must point out that 2/3 of the respondents were from the US and 1/3 from EMEA, but I think the results were pretty similar, and I'll show you in a minute, but I think it's still very relevant to the discussion we're having today. I'm sure no one would be surprised to know that of those respondents, 94% felt more concerned about security now than they did pre-COVID-19. For those interested, I believe a copy of the survey will be provided after today's session, but feel free to go to Tripwire's State of Security and you'll find a copy of Tim Erlin's report, Cybersecurity Must Be an Integral Part of Your Pandemic Response Plan, which was written using the information we gained from the survey. That said, I'd like to discuss some of the challenges being faced by public and private sector organisations, as there seems, in all honesty, to be little difference between the challenges faced by both areas of business. So I'm going to cover some of the COVID-19 related attacks. We'll look in a little bit more detail at the three main culprits. We'll go through what you should be doing to protect remote assets, a little bit about training and support and how that should look. And then I'd like to have a look and see how the survey results fit with what we're actually seeing in the real world. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with one of the interesting stats from our survey. And this, I promise this is not all about the survey, but I thought this was quite interesting. So of the 345 IT security professionals surveyed, 7 had already been breached by a COVID-19 related attack. And I'm looking at the blue numbers here. I'm not splitting out North America from EMEA. I don't think there's a need. 210 had seen attempts, unsuccessful attempts, fortunately. And then the other 128 weren't aware or hadn't seen evidence of any attack. So how does this fit with what we're currently seeing? Well, the National Cybersecurity Centre is telling us that state-sponsored hacking or state-sponsored hackers are targeting healthcare, research labs and universities that are involved in national or international COVID-19 research. The main vector of those attacks seems to be misconfigured or unpatched VPN solutions and unpatched applications such as Citrix. And although the research establishments are the end goal, the attacks seem to be targeted at the supply chain, as that appears to be the softer target. What they've also noticed is the need to maintain good communication across the now remote workforce has pressured individuals and organizations into installing unfamiliar communication apps in a compressed timeline. In the past 3 months, they've seen a huge increase in cyber criminals taking advantage of vulnerabilities and misconfiguration of applications like Zoom, Microsoft Teams, and Google Meets, and the other general communication chats we use. But I have to say, the vendors have been quick to react, and I believe that all of the known vulnerabilities have now been mitigated with either software updates or patches. However, misconfigurations may not have been, and that will be a major issue. On the other side of the pond, and I think this is relevant because it's a global issue, the FBI are reporting approximately 192,000 COVID-19 related cyber attacks every week. And about 90% of these start as phishing email, many of them impersonating the World Health Organization, the United Nations, or some other official organization working with COVID-19 within the COVID-19 arena. The phishing emails obviously are attempting to trick users into clicking infected documents or links, which enable malware to be downloaded onto the user's computer. Now, the majority of malware being deployed that they can see is keyloggers and ransomware. Obviously, keyloggers to capture passwords and useful information and give them further access into systems. And the ransomware, well, we all know how that works. So for the next 5 or 10 minutes, I'm going to concentrate on the three main culprits, the three challenges that we need to protect our business against. And that's the phishing email, the malware that is deployed by some of the links on these phishing email, and the looking at virtual private networks. Next slide, please. So we'll look at phishing first. So as you all probably know, phishing takes three forms. There is general phishing, which is aimed at anyone who can be reached by the attacker. We have spear phishing, which is much more targeted. It's normally targeted towards a specific business or a group or even an individual. And then we have what's called whaling, which is aimed at the high-profile individuals within a business, so people like the board members. Although we haven't specifically seen a significant increase in phishing emails, we have seen a change of focus from the financial lures that they used to use to the COVID-19 or coronavirus lures. So emails are coming in with titles like COVID-19 daily updates, new confirmed outbreak in your town, city or area, things like that. But to be honest, it's kind of less about the subject and more about the results. And the main aim of the attackers, as we said, is to gain access to credentials, usernames, passwords, etc., or to deploy the most common malwares, which, as I said earlier, were keyloggers and ransomware. So what can we be doing to protect our organizations? Well, to be honest, a lot of it is still the basics. So to improve your resilience and prevent your domain from being used for spoofing, you need to employ a multi-layered approach. So basically, you're back to defense in depth. Now, because phishing attacks are used as the primary method for deploying the malware, many of the suggestions I'm going to make here are also suggestions that will come up in the malware section. So the first thing you need to look at is, how do you make it more difficult for the attacker to reach your users? So you need to be looking at, and I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail because we don't have the time today, but you need to be looking at anti-spoofing using protocols, different techniques, policies. So things like domain-based message authentication reporting and conformance, better known as DMARC, or domain keys identified mail, and there is also sender policy frameworks that are available out there that should be used. You need to reduce the amount of, or try to reduce the amount of information useful to the hacker that you're providing on your websites. As I said, this is all kind of basics. You need to educate users about their digital footprint and how it can impact not just the business, but them personally. Use available tools to block or filter incoming phishing emails, so blacklisting, things like that. You need to protect yourself against undetected phishing emails, so emails that get passed. So you need to be looking at using solutions like malware detection, configuration management, file integrity monitoring. You need to only use supported versions of applications and make sure that your patching is up to date. Try and make sure that only admins, where possible, can install applications on your systems. And you make sure that your policy dictates that they never use those admin accounts to browse the web or to check on their email. Protect users from malicious websites. Most browsers use URL blacklisting to block malicious sites. You can use whitelisting, and that can be used to implicitly allow specific sites. Use proxy services to block attempts to reach websites that have been identified as hosting malware. A really important one is, where possible, to use two-factor authentication, because that reduces the risk of any stolen credentials being useful on your network. And then always apply the policy of least privilege. And that means, when you consider that the damage an attacker can do is directly proportionate to the privilege of the account that they access. So if your users don't have admin access, then they don't get admin rights to your systems, or it's more difficult for them to do so. Next slide, please. So we're going to look at malware. And malware covers any malicious software, really, that, if executed, will cause harm to your systems, operations, or reputation. The most prevalent currently, as we've discussed, is ransomware and keyloggers. And as you all know, ransomware is a specific type of malware that denies a business legitimate access to critical data by means of encryption, and a keylogger records the keystrokes on the specific device it's installed to capture critical information such as login credentials, personal information, or even business confidential documents. Unfortunately, there's no silver bullet that protects you from malware infection, so you should expect and plan to be infected at some point. So again, the best strategy is defense in depth, using that multi-layered approach. So some of the key actions you should be taking to reduce your risk and the impact of infection are things like, you need to be making regular offline backups. Now, it's not going to prevent you getting the infection, but it's going to aid you to quickly and cleanly recover without the need to consider paying any ransom. Block websites that are known to be malicious, and as we mentioned earlier, that you can use blacklisting, you can use whitelisting, proxy services. And if you're going to use proxy services, I would advise any public sector organization or business to look at the NCSC Protective DNS service. Actively inspect the content, your download content in particular, filtering email attachments and file downloads. You should be using central management for your enterprise devices to permit only trusted apps to run. Education, good housekeeping, sound processes and strong policies are all really important. Supported software versions are critical, and always keep them up to date with patches. Employ and maintain file integrity monitoring. This is the same stuff we discussed earlier. Vulnerability assessment, malware detection, and my favorite, antivirus, the solution that apparently should have died 10 years ago. And as I said, these are the basics. They're the basics of a good security strategy, which hopefully everyone already has. Next slide, please. So, virtual private networks. Okay, so with most of our employees now working from home, VPN services have been pushed to the forefront. So it's no surprise to find that VPN now forms a critical part of most organizations' IT and communications backbone. The security, and by which I mean confidentiality, integrity, and availability, or CIA for anybody old enough to remember that term, must be one of the primary focuses of any IT team. A few of the things that I'd expect them to be looking at is making sure that they've scaled the VPN concentrators, the portals, and the gateways to cope with the additional remote connections. They need to ensure that VPN services are up to date and fully patched, and that's the same with any application, to be honest. Look at enabling multi-factor authentication to protect those VPN accounts. Again, this is specifically targeted phishing attacks that deploy the keylogging software. If they manage to get the password, at least if you're using multi-factor authentication, it's not going to get them to where they want to be. Employee constant is the word I was looking for. Monitoring of your VPN performance and availability. Now that the VPN is acting as a critical gateway into your network, it's likely that cyber criminals are going to look at targeting with things like the DDoS attack, which is going to exhaust your VPN system resources and obviously crash the servers. One thing to consider, and I wouldn't expect this to be a big problem, I hope, in the public sector, but if employees are using personal computers because there just aren't enough work laptops to go around, then you need to be looking at what their security status is. What access controls have they got? What shared, what users do they share that machine with? What software have they got on there? What patches are they, are they up to date with patches? Basic security applications, what are they running? Obviously, if it's not a corporate machine, it's very difficult to control that kind of system. What level of trust should they be given? This is a risk assessment that the business should be taking based on, what their security status is with regards to the device they're using, and what level of access should they have to organizations' files, shares, and other resources. Because at the end of the day, they probably don't need the same level of access as they had in the office, but they do need access. But if they're sharing that machine with 4 or 5 other people, or even 2 other people, do you really want them having access to some of your confidential information or access to critical devices? I'd strongly recommend that any public sector organization, again, refers to the NCSC guidance, and that will give you information as to the type of VPN you should be using and the best practice configurations for that VPN. And if you look at the NCS guidance, you'll find that a lot of the information we're talking about today is covered over the last, well, it's probably been covered over the last 6 to 8, 12 months, but it's certainly become more focused over the last 2 or 3 months. Next slide, please. So I want to quickly look at protecting your remote assets. So obviously from a business perspective, we're going to want to try and mirror the internal network security practices, processes, and applications. Being able to monitor for known vulnerabilities or configuration changes or compliance status are all critical elements of ensuring security of devices used both on the network and remotely. There aren't any real technical reasons that the same tools being used within the network, providing these services, shouldn't be able to handle the same tasks in a more distributed network environment. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. There are lots of good, valid reasons why they can't. But what we're seeing is a gap in the products that we're deploying rather than any technical barrier. And a good example of this is a vulnerability solution. So a vulnerability assessment, if you're using an agent-based solution, then the location of the endpoint really doesn't matter that much. However, if you're using a network-based vulnerability solution, then as the asset moves out of the network, then it becomes invisible. I think a good starting point is to only deploy, and this is if you have control over these devices, only deploy remote hardware that is being configured using your certified gold build, if you have a certified gold build. All remote devices need to be centrally managed. So you need to manage the applications, the versions, the configuration, the patching. And use solutions, again, we've talked about these before, change management to monitor for unauthorized changes on those devices, compliance management to alert you if they fall out of compliance, vulnerability management to identify any new vulnerabilities that appear on them and any patches that may be missing. And then malware detection, and again, my old friend, antivirus. Please make sure that your users understand the risks associated with unauthorized access to their work device. And by that, I'm not talking about somebody else from outside getting access. I'm talking about members of their family or other members of their household. I know that some organizations have allowed guest access that segments the guest from the main system and is purged on a schedule or when the guest logs out. I don't particularly think that's a good solution, but some organizations have gone down that route. And make sure that all of your remote users are fully trained on the new applications, such as the communications software that's now being used and video conferencing software, and of course the VPN. Next slide, please. So I've only got a little bit on training and support. With regards to support, it's just remember it's not just about work. Make sure your mobile workforce has all the contact information they need to cover not just the technical issues they may suffer, but also administrative issues and personal challenges. If possible, an out-of-hours number should be made available for emergencies. And try and organize weekly and fortnightly town hall sessions. I mean, we do these ourselves within our organization every 2 weeks. Try and keep it less formal. Try to make it a bit more of a social event to help people stay connected, basically. And if necessary, apply it to smaller groups. Instead of having a very large group, split it down into smaller groups. With regards to training, most organizations use online training, so it shouldn't really change that much. You just need to remember that if you're deploying new applications, i.e. a VPN they may never have used before, communications and video conferencing software, make sure all users receive adequate training to ensure that they're not only getting the most benefit out of the solution, but they're not creating the business additional risk. Run regular updates. It's no good just running the training once, especially if you've got more than one application, because people forget. So run regular updates and refresher sessions. You can do them either live or recorded. And if you're doing recorded, then you need to make sure that you include contact details for questions and issues, should they have any. Next slide, please. And finally, back to our survey. So what I wanted to do as the last thing was to check out our survey and see how it reflected what we're actually seeing in the wild. So interestingly enough, when we asked the survey participants, what areas of your security are you more concerned about now than you were prior to COVID-19, 58% of the respondents said employee home network security, 45% said increased ransomware phishing and social engineering attacks. 41% had keeping remote systems configured securely, 38% keeping remote systems compliant, and 38% securing and analyzing the traffic coming through our VPNs. So it pretty much fits in with what we're hearing from NCSC, the FBI, and other organizations with regards to what we're seeing live in the wild. Next slide. So now we're going to open up for questions.
Thank you very much for that, Paul. We've got about half an hour left for questions. So for audience members, please do type any questions you have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. I've got one here that I'll start off with. Paul, you mentioned that of the IT security professionals surveyed by Tripwire, 2% said they'd been breached in a COVID-19 related attack, and 61% had seen unsuccessful attempts. What can affected organisations learn from individual attacks and attempts, and how can they use those learnings to better protect their systems?
So I can't speak specifically to any one of those attacks, but what I would say is that from the anecdotal evidence we have, again, it's down to the majority of them are started off with a phishing attack, and it's then either the keylogger or the ransomware. I mean, ransomware we've struggled with for many years now. Keyloggers have been around for a long time. I think the key to this is making sure that you're using best practice configuration for any of the tools that you're using or applications. Make sure that you keep them up to date with regards to patches. And I know patches have to be tested for a certain period of time before they're deployed into the production environment. That's fine, but have a process that guarantees that that's done within a shorter period as possible. And then it's down to education. You know, at the end of the day, the user is normally our weakest link, and that's not because they're, you know, weak or stupid. It's just human nature. So education. It's key to make sure that not only do you run these education sessions, but you make them interactive and you make them kind of fun. Because if it's boring, they've forgotten 5 minutes after they've completed it. You know, running a 30-minute session where they have to watch a video, answer 5 questions right, and then move on to the next video, it might give them the information they need, but they're unlikely to absorb it for more than the time it takes them to get through that. And it's a bit like a tick box scenario. So the more you can do, you know, some wargaming with email. What our company does is we're not regularly, but we randomly receive phishing emails, and we report them or we don't report them. If you open them up, then they will let you know that you missed it, and they will, you know, talk to you, or they will try and educate you further. And if you get it, then great. It's kind of announced 80%, 85%, whatever it is, successfully identified, you know, the last phishing email. And it's about telling them when they're successful. It's not about punishing people for their mistakes, not in this kind of environment.
Yeah, okay. And on that education piece and on phishing emails, you know, some of them are very convincing. And you mentioned that more and more now they're coming from very well-known, or appears to come from very well-known organisations. How can employees determine which are legitimate emails and which are malicious ones? You know, what are the telltale signs that they can look out for, and how do you get that across in training sessions?
So there's a few things. When you're looking at the email, as you said, they are becoming much better at putting these templates together, but they are normally templates. So you're looking for things like urgency. If they're trying to enforce urgency so that you take an action quickly, and by that I mean things like if you don't act in the next so many minutes, then you've lost the opportunity, or making you feel under pressure by suggesting that it may have consequences for your health, things like that, then that's quite worrying, because that's not what you'd normally get from a legitimate organization. You'd get helpful advice. You wouldn't get, the threat of illness or something like that. The other thing is they're going to have links. They're going to try and link you to a website, or they're going to ask you to open a document. And with most browsers, if you drift over the top of those links, it will give you the true address. You need to.
Oh, I think you're muted there, Paul.
They're spoofing the actual.
Sorry, Paul, I think we missed a short section there.
Sorry. So if you drift over the top of the link, it will give you the true address. And what I'm saying is they're getting much cleverer now. They're actually registering URLs with COVID-19 or coronavirus in the title, or they're spoofing the actual legitimate organization that they're saying to represent. But if you look at, more often than not, if you look at the address, it may look valid, but if you look at it carefully, you'll see that there are slight differences. They may have put a 1 in instead of an I. They may have an underscore to split a word that isn't in the legitimate. And if you are concerned, go to the legitimate site. Don't use the link. And to be honest, that's the best advice I can give to users.
Thank you. And sort of following on from that as well, you mentioned the survey results at the end there, that one of the biggest concerns is people now working from home. And as part of that, people are having to rely on communication tools. And there are sort of risks and concerns around those, particularly if people are dealing with sensitive information. How can these tools and platforms be used as securely as possible before more robust options and software updates become available?
Okay, so as I said, most of those solutions have made changes recently, and they've released patches, but that still doesn't prevent access. So some of the things that have been happening is people have been having company meetings, and they're actually getting people outside the company attending those meetings because they've managed to get into the system. So things that they need to be looking at is it's one of the reasons why I said try and reduce the size of your weekly or 2 weekly meetings, because it makes it much easier to manage. If you know who's going to be there, then it's easier for you to monitor who's on the phone call or who's on the video conference. Patching, as we said, patching is really important. Make sure you're up to date with patches. Make sure it's supported by the corporate. One of the things we've seen is lots of people using the same solution that they use in their private life because it's available, they know how it works, but it's not approved by the business. And that's why I said central management of those devices is key, because you need to make sure that users are not able to download a piece of software because they've used it before, but that it's a centrally managed piece of software by the business. And that way they can do best practice configuration and make sure that they are as safe as possible when using those solutions.
Yeah. Okay. And going back to your point about unauthorized access as well, does the increased cybersecurity threat provide a natural cap on remote working by making it impossible for civil servants in certain fields, such as those handling sensitive data, to work from home, or can robust systems be built to protect that kind of information?
So there are robust, secure networks that are virtual private networks that can be used by government. Normally, they don't allow the majority of users to access restricted or confidential information, but in this time, I guess you have to in some cases. And when doing that, you just have to make sure that you are using a known, trusted virtual private network. Where necessary, you are encrypting. Even though it's an encrypted connection, you can still send encrypted files across. But it's basics. It's making sure that you're only giving access to the information that is absolutely necessary for that person to do their job. You are monitoring that access to make sure that they are working within their normal remits. So, if they're accessing it at 3 o'clock in the morning, that's very unlikely to be the person that you're expecting to be on that connection. And make sure that where possible, you're always using encryption, and that includes the virtual private network connections.
Mm-hmm. Actually, on that point, we had a question in from someone watching on VPNs. Someone that wants to know how to secure and patch those networks. So more of a technical question, but if you could tell us a little bit more about that, that would be great.
So I'm not a technical guru on VPNs as much as I'd like to be, but what I would suggest is if they go to the NCSC website, they have provided a lot of good information around the use of VPNs, what type of VPN should be used in which situations, and the best practice configuration for those VPNs.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, no, I can't tell them exactly how they do it. And to be honest, you would need to know more about the environment that they're working in. Whether it's a classified environment, non-classified, what business area they're working in, and more about the network, to be honest.
Yeah. Okay. And going back to COVID-19, you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation there supply chains and the risk of disrupting those. Now, obviously, that could be devastating at any time, but particularly during a pandemic like this. What particular risks are there around cyber criminals focusing on attacking supply chains, and how can government IT teams protect against those?
So what we're seeing is not so much an attack on the supply chain itself, but it's using the supply chain as a staging post to then get into either, and I was talking specifically about the NHS, universities and other research establishments. So what they're doing there is they're finding it easier to get through the security that's provided on most supply chains, which then enables them more opportunity to connect and get access to the NHS or the university or the research lab. So it's more about ensuring that the supply chains you're using have the correct level of security applied to their environments. And again, they're going to be working from home, a lot of the supply chain. So, it's no good having a policy or an agreement with a third-party supplier that, relies on their network security if 2/3 of their employees are no longer on the network. They're outside the network. So, risk assessments that were previously passed may well need to be revisited. But it's going to be a struggle for everyone involved, because you're trying to secure your own environment, your own extended environment. They're trying to secure their extended environment. But I think working together, helping each other understand what the challenges and what the threats are, can only be for the good of the environment. And again, I can't stress enough, the NCSC website has a huge amount of information that helps both public and private sector organisations to defend themselves in this current period.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And this may be a question that could be answered by that organisation as well, but I just wondered, the majority of attacks are committed by fairly low-level cyber criminals, but there's an increasing threat from state actors. How can government departments best protect themselves from foreign interference?
That's a difficult question, because we've been trying to do that for a long time.
Yeah.
The difference between state actors and cyber criminals and general hackers is twofold. One is target, and the second is finance. So, a state supported or state sponsored attack, they are likely to have access to a lot of data that's been collected over a long period of time. They're not in a particular hurry. They will go slowly to make sure that they're not easily identified. And they've had a lot of very good training. So protecting, again, you're back to the basics. It is, unfortunately, there are no silver bullets. It's utilizing the tools that you have available, and making sure that you're not just paying lip service and just glancing through the logs from a lot of these solutions. You're actually feeding those logs into maybe a SIM device that is then correlating the information and giving you a better picture of what's going on in your organization. Now, that said, a lot of these tools, like I said previously, there should be no problem utilizing those with remote users, but we know that there are problems, because they were never designed with that in mind. A lot of solutions are network based, and once you remove devices and put them outside the network, those devices become invisible, so they're more difficult to monitor and manage. But that's the only way that you're going to protect yourself against not just state-sponsored attacks, but any attack.
Yeah. And do you recommend that governments collaborate and share information together, both between themselves and between governments and the private sector? Can that help to prevent cyber attacks?
Absolutely. Collaboration is going to build stronger environments. You just need to make sure you're collaborating with the right people. Because I seem to remember reading an article quite recently about an organization that was all about assisting business to be more secure, only for the authorities to discover that they were selling a lot of the information they were getting from business onto the dark web. So you have to do your due diligence, but when it comes at the government level, absolutely, you've got very good relationships across most of Europe with the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and probably with a lot of the Asia Pac countries as well. We all need to be working together to fight this. One of the things I always say when I do conferences is, put your hand up, all those people who wake up in the morning thinking, fantastic, another day in the office or another day at work. not many people put their hands up, but the people that we're up against do. They love, they're quite happy to work 38 hours, straight, because they find it exciting. It's a different, a completely different culture. We do this as a job, we enjoy it, and we do our best. But at the end of the day, we have other commitments in our life. They tend to be committed to this one job, this one thing, which gives them an advantage. So the more people you can get working together, the more people collaborating, the stronger our defenses should be.
Yeah. Okay. And sort of talking about hackers there, is there merit in governments employing ethical hackers or offering bug bounties to assess the security of their computer systems?
Sorry, you broke up there. Can you repeat that one?
Yeah, sure. Is there merit in governments employing ethical hackers or offering bug bounties to assess the security of computer systems?
I personally think there's merit to it. I would be surprised if, apart from obviously some of the higher security networks, I would be surprised if government organisations aren't using ethical hackers to assist them to identify. I mean, if you're employing penetration testing, which you should be as a part of your your annual assessments and risk assessments, then they are pretty much ethical hackers. They may not class themselves as hackers, but that's what they're doing. They're attempting to hack into your system, but they're being ethical about it. So it's difficult to draw that line. But I definitely think we should be using all the skill sets that are available to us. Obviously, again, background checks, do your homework. If that person's been around for many years and has worked for lots of organizations, check with those organizations how he's performed or how they've performed, if it's an organization, and make a decision. But yes, if those skills are available to you and it's a trusted resource, then why not?
Yeah. And mention skills there. How about skills within government IT teams or organisation IT teams as they stand? How can those skills be and those capabilities be boosted to better protect against cyber attacks and to make sure the infrastructure is more robust going forward?
So this is a challenge for public sector because unfortunately, and this may not be politically correct, but unfortunately, public sector salaries do not match up to private sector salaries. So if you've got somebody who's looking for a role, they have the right skill sets, then the chances are they're going to get a better deal staying in the private sector, which is not good for the public sector. People in the public sector are normally committed to the public sector. They enjoy the lifestyle, the culture, and that's great. But unfortunately, a lot of them are drawn out of that environment to work in the private sector. So for me, the ideal solution here is for the public sector to utilize the private sector. So if you don't have the resources, you don't have the skill sets, then look around, find a third-party private sector organization that can help, because it may be an additional cost, but in the long run, it's going to be highly valuable to your business with regards to reducing risk, reducing costs. I mean, if you get breached and it's proved to be because of negligence, then there are massive fines involved, and nobody wants to go down that road. So again, if you have the resources available, whether they're your resources or a third party providing some form of managed service, then if you can do that, do that.
Yeah. All right, great. I think we've just about got time for a couple more questions. I mean, we know that an awful lot of work has been done since the outbreak began and cyber attacks began to increase, onshoring up IT systems. And a lot of that work has had to be done very, very quickly. How can the work that's been done so far be built on to minimise the risks as working practices change, as we expect they might, and perhaps as remote working becomes more common?
So I don't believe it's in question anymore. I think more people will be working at home for, well, I can't see, you know, everyone going back to the office job. I think for two reasons. The health reason is one, but also I think organizations that previously were concerned about, you know, managing people remotely or making sure that they're getting the correct level of work out of people that they don't have direct control over. I think a lot of that has gone. People have now realized that, you know, they can work remotely and responsibly, and they can deliver a good level of work, just as good as they can in an office, and in some cases better. So I think a lot more people will stay remote. What organizations need to do now is consolidate. So they need to look at what they now have that is no longer within their network boundary. They need to decide on exactly what solutions they're going to put in place, or what solutions they've put in place already but need to be configured correctly, because a lot of it is down to misconfiguration. And you get that when you get a new solution that you've never used before. You've got to learn quickly, deploy it quickly. There's going to be mistakes, so they now have to go back and do that due diligence. They need to go back and look at the configuration. And again, I'm going to mention them again. NCSC. They have a lot of information on there on best practice configurations for different solutions. And even if they don't cover the solution you've got, they will cover something similar, and they will give you the information or a template of information that you can use. But it is a case of, you know, consolidating the solutions to make sure that as many as possible are the same solution that they were already using internally, and then making sure that they are configured and that configuration is maintained.
Yeah. Okay. And one more question then, I think, before we finish, can just about squeeze it in. Do you think then that that governments, you know, they've been forced to adopt perhaps more sophisticated protective tools recently? Do you think that they're going to be better shielded from future attacks, or could a lack of focus on cybersecurity once the immediate threat is over mean that any progress is perhaps lost?
No, I don't think so. I think organizations may have identified some new solutions which they have found very useful, and they decide to continue with, and that's good. I don't think government was particularly any more weak in cybersecurity than private sector. You know, you have good and bad in both. So I've lost my train of thought for a second there. So I think that there may be some improvement. I don't think it will be because the government departments weren't doing the right thing in the first place. I think this has just given them an opportunity to identify some other options, maybe. And it may well have provided them with some necessary budget that wasn't available previously. I think you're right. Focus was lost on the cybersecurity side in the haste to get devices and software deployed. But from our survey, majority of the security professionals understand that that's what's happened and are working very hard to make sure that they backfill. And nobody wants to have bolt-ons.
So I think, none of these solutions should be looked at as a bolt-on. It either becomes a part of your strategy, or it's removed and you put something else in its place that does a better job.
Great, thank you very much for that. We're out of time. So again, thank you to you, Paul, and to Tripwire. And particularly thank you to the audience. We really hope that you found it useful. We'll be emailing you with a link to the slides, the recording and the write-up. And meanwhile, thank you to all the civil servants watching for all the work you're doing to support the public and deliver public services at this very strange and difficult time. Thank you.